Thank you very much. Hello, Hungary. Very happy to join you, even though online. On the next slide, please. I will be talking about some threats, climate-related threats to critical water infrastructure. And by this infrastructure, for purpose of this presentation, will be talking about the water reservoirs, water supply pipelines, wastewater treatment facilities. And when we think about the climate-related infrastructure and threats, we usually think about physical destruction or damage to the system. We also see the impact of coastal flooding from the sea level rise. In Central Asia, for example, we very much see the changes in pattern of water availability that will affect infrastructure development, but also operation of infrastructure. And in other threats that we can physically see and assess, its effects related to high temperature on operating cost of infrastructure. But I think it's very important to look on other unrelated, probably, or indirectly related factors such as economic development, population, and technological changes that will affect and alter, in some cases, the level of risk, and sometimes even have more significant impact on resilient infrastructure planning, design, and economics than climate threats themselves. For example, we can see how the impact of changes in precipitation might affect the requirements for water storage. But we also see that it will, no, can you please go back to the previous slide? Yes, you can also see that these trends will be dependent on the changes and trends in the consumption itself, which will be affected also by economic development, population, and technological changes. And most of the time, and many times, this impact will be mostly felt in low-income countries where the general resilience is lower. And on the next slide, you can see some examples of the physical climate-related risk, and you can see how different climatic risk might cause different damage, physical damage, efficiency and output losses, and also cost related to its maintenance. And mostly we see that most impacts of climate change will be felt through maintenance cost increase. And on next slide, you see two graphs that very clear show that infrastructure plays a very critical role in enabling long-term development. But also infrastructure is responsible for almost 80% of greenhouse emissions, with most of it coming from the energy sector, from the building and transport services. But interestingly enough, on the second graph, you can see that almost 90% of all adaptation costs will be coming from the water and building sectors. And the water sector is expected to require the most investment to adaptation. It's almost 54%. And surely this is largely due to infrastructure restructuring and rebuilding, due to the flood risk, due to the rise of sea level. And on the next slide, I would like to show some call for action. We always talk that nowadays more infrastructure built than ever in history, but we also read a lot that new infrastructure will be needed. And that's why I think it's very important to think and to ensure that this infrastructure is rightly built and rightly designed, because if it's poorly designed or built in unsustainable way, then it can increase and accelerate environmental problems and can increase climate impact or even increase socioeconomic vulnerabilities. And that's why there is a need for integrated and systematic approach to infrastructure building and restructuring. What does it mean? It means that we have to look at the long-term strategies to address national development priorities, along with international commitments and using existing and future infrastructure in very sustainable way. And we also need infrastructure that provides essential services with ensuring social, economic, and environmental sustainability. And finally, and importantly, and in some regions it's not discussed yet, we have to recognize that many services that now provided by infrastructure and felt mostly in this structural way can be delivered by non-structural way, by ecosystems from the natural environment, enhancing benefits and creating more trade-offs through the infrastructure life cycle. On the next slide, there's some examples from the guidelines that we have already, how we can design, how we can plan, how we can deliver, and how we can manage the infrastructure in a way that promotes adaptation in the different sectors. I just picked up one example from the recent OECD report on climate resilient infrastructure, looking at the different sectors. And for the water sectors, they suggest that we have to be more involving participatory stakeholder consultation to enhance local adaptive capacity. We have to design nature-based solutions where it's possible. On the delivery stage, we have to think about system redundancy in system design, meaning that water supply can be ensured by incorporating other sources of water. So it has to be already built in the system design. And also engage more with the private sector. Make this sector more attractive for the private companies to ensure that system operates efficiently, provide good services, and also enhance resilience. And finally, at the management level, promote adaptive operational regimes. As I told, mostly the sustainability and resilience of infrastructure depends how it's operated, to provide different benefits for economies, but also ecosystems and biodiversity. And finally, again, the same question and the same message that we might use natural protective measures to reduce the vulnerability of the system, meaning the nature-based solution has to be promoted and more clearly transferred to the regions where the infrastructure is developing. Next slide, please. And briefly, I just want to provide some examples from the Central Asia, on the water sector of Central Asia. You know that we have the most complex water management system that was built already in the Soviet time, and the countries, within the countries and between the countries, very much depend on this infrastructure. And the water sector will be at risk for the sustainable provision of water services due to climate change, but even most importantly, of the combined effects of the socioeconomic factors and legacy issues, including the poor environmental situation, the poor state of infrastructure, and I would say the poor state of the human capacities. And it might be numerous examples, but I just picked up two, focusing on hydraulic infrastructure, water management, or water reservoirs. Most water comes from the water reservoirs in Central Asia countries, but we've seen that the useful capacity of these reservoirs has been diminished due to sedimentation, and it costs a lot of money, according to different assessments, up to 13 billion per year. And majority of this irrigation and drainage infrastructure, as I said, has poor funding, and that's why it's not maintained in the way that it should be. And finally, uncoordinated management of the infrastructure for different purposes within the country, but also between the countries, doesn't help to improve the efficiency of the system. And if we look at the threat of climate, the flow fluctuation that is expected in Central Asia will complicate the conditions of the management of infrastructure even more. And another example on the next slide, it relates to pumping station or electric lift irrigation system. Most countries, and especially Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, relies on water that is pumped to the system, and it's a huge area, almost of 2 million hectares, and up to 50% of irrigation water is lifted by the pumping station, and they're all in very poor technical conditions. And if you can imagine that the irrigation sector consumes about 20% of the total electricity use in Uzbekistan and about 11 in Tajikistan. And on the climate change side, this might disturb operation of existing pumping systems due to the low level of water in the canals and different irrigation structures. And on the next slide, we really need the urgent response and how far we are with the efficiency of this reaction. At the law and policy level, all countries are parties to the UN Climate Change Convention, and some of them are also parties to the UNEC conventions. But at the regional national level, there is no climate change adaptation plans, particularly for irrigation, agriculture, or energy yet. And regional climate strategy is only now under development and under discussion in the countries. That's why the more proactive measures, including enhancing international commitments and also instruments as a strategic environmental assessment, environmental impact assessments, is needed in the region. Institutions, human technical capacity and data availability and tools and guidance documents are all underdeveloped and quite limited. And even though we know in theory what does it mean, but when you go and talk to people at different institutions and water users, they don't know how to implement it. So from the discussion at the policy levels, I think we have to go down to the field, down to the people and the professionals, explaining them in very fair and clear language what they need to do on the daily basis to ensure that the response that we're having is adaptive enough. And on the next slide, options and responses related to management. First of all, we need more coordinated water and energy management, and it relates both at the national and transboundary level, which will increase in general the resilience of the system, institutional resilience, but also resilience to the climate change. And as I said, we need to shift from the design for life approach to the building of infrastructure, not only to dam and reservoirs, to life cycle management, ensuring that we can be adaptable through the cycle, improving and monitoring the system. And when we talk about technology, sometimes we think that technology might change everything, but it's not. Technology also has to be smartly implemented. And in some countries in Central Asia, we have push for example, drip irrigation introduction, but it's not always context-based. So even introduction of the advanced irrigation technology has to be smart enough to ensure the sustainability and efficiency. Then it will create incentives both for the water users and also suppliers. And here we come to the most important question of finance, where I think we have to be doing more and more, attracting investment, but also creating incentives for all stakeholders to engage in this exercise. And my final slide with the key takeaways that I would like to suggest. And the most importantly, again and again, we have to think about combined understanding of physical and other related risk. Especially when I look at Central Asia, we are understanding that it's not climate change itself threatening the system, but this combined effect with other factors and interdependencies that might be complicating situation within the countries and across the countries. And that's why it's essential to understand how all actors can understand those interdependencies and work together to build more resilient infrastructure, but also more resilient response. And so I think this is my main question, that we have to not only talk about the climate change, but through other factors that also affect, in order to have integrated and systemic response to the challenges we have. Thank you.